It says in verse 3, you return men back to dust, saying, return to dust, O sons of men. The Bible says we're made out of dust. From dust we are, to dust we'll return. We don't like to think about that, at some point, I'm just going to decompose and I'll be gone, I'll be dust again. But that's all we are. We have this sense of great self-importance, like, I'm really great, but no, you just return to dust. The Bible talks about how God sweeps men away in the sleep of death. They're like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it's dried and withered. There's a companion piece to this in the Bible in the book of Ecclesiastes. Moses is writing these words. Solomon at one point took stock of life and what it is all about. And this is what he concluded. And keep in mind now, this is Moses, the leader of people, and King Solomon, who went about doing great works like you and I probably will never have the opportunity to do, and yet he says this about life as he surveys it. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. I hated all the things I'd toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he'll be a wise man or a fool? Yet he'll have control over all the work into which I've poured my effort and skill under the sun. This, too, is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. For a man may do his work with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then he must leave all he owns to someone who has not worked for it. This, too, is meaningless and a great misfortune. What does a man get for all the toil and anxious striving with which he labors under the sun? All his days his work is pain and grief. Even at night his mind does not rest. This, too, is meaningless. We spend an awful lot of energy doing the things that we do. There are a lot of anxious thoughts, things we worry over, are concerned about. We go about our life's work, pouring all our energy into it, thinking this is really something. And yet I want you to be aware of something. At the end of your life, you're going to have to hand that work over to someone. Solomon, when he says this, he says, man, when it was all said and done, I realized the person I may hand it off to may be a fool and may lose it all. There are people sitting in this room who have retired from their life's occupation. When you're retired, it may be that they closed down the division of that company. It may be that the person who came after you couldn't do the job half as well, and now that's not even functioning anymore. But even if that doesn't happen in our lifetime, well, I just think about this sometime. Right now in this room, I want you to think about your great-grandparents. Do you know their names? Do you know what they did for a living? How about your great-great-grandparents? Do you know what they did for a living? Do you know what their worries and anxieties were? Most of us are probably at this point, I don't know. I'd be surprised if we all knew our great-great-grandparents' names. We probably all don't. We are the people on this earth who are closest to them. No one else in this room is going to remember them. In just another 2 or 3 or 4 generations, we'll join their ranks. There won't be anyone who knows any of what we did, and maybe they won't even remember our name. We don't often like to think about things like this. It's a very sobering thought. I stay up at night thinking, toiling over, putting in my work, and at the end of the day, Moses and Solomon said, yeah, it's all going to come to nothing. What's up with that? I think about this with regard to my own life's work, by the way. I'm a preacher. I spend a lot of time preparing sermons. I stay up at night sometimes. I have thoughts that come to me like, oh yeah, that'll be a great way to say it. I really want people to know about Jesus, and so, man, okay, that's a great way. I'm going to say it this weekend just like that. I'm going to sleep over it. And I think it's good every once in a while for me to remember a story like this. The pastor that I had growing up until I was in junior high and early high school, I sat back and tried to remember at some point whether I could think of a single sermon he preached, and realized he probably put all the effort that I put into it. I can't think of the content of a single sermon. Except for one thing I do remember. I remember one time we were at an evening service. We were in a small church. There was maybe about 20. We actually put the chairs around in a circle. He was sitting on one end. I was sitting off to his right. I remember he had his legs crossed. He sat down and was preaching. And as he was preaching, there was a fly that started to buzz around his head. And as he was speaking, suddenly that fly flew right into his mouth. At which point he went, pff, pff, pff. His son, who was a high schooler, was sitting straight across from him, or straight across the circle, and he got the giggles. And he couldn't stop laughing. And that laughter grew and grew and grew. And finally, this is the only line I can remember that he said while preaching, "Darren, cut it out." But I think about the effort that he probably put into all those sermons, and I can't remember a single one, and it was a good sobering thought for me to remember. I'd have a better chance of you remembering this sermon if there was a fly buzzing around my head. As much energy and effort we put into the work that we do, at some point, it all comes to nothing. Not only is life brief, it's almost nearly meaningless. And then, as Moses writes, he adds to that it's full of pain. If you still have your Bibles open, I want you to look with me beginning in verse 7. He says, "We're consumed by your anger and terrified by your indignation. You've set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your presence. All our days pass away under your wrath. We finish our years with a moan. The length of our days is 70 years or 80 if we have the strength. Yet their span is but trouble and sorrow. For they quickly pass, and we fly away." Trouble and sorrow. I don't have to spend time talking to you about what happens in life, the physical pains that we at some point come to endure. I don't have to spend time talking to you about the trouble that humanity faces in general, the conflicts that we can read about in the newspaper each and every day. But I would just point this out, that even the most joyful things we have in this life are often riddled with struggle and pain. I've thought about it for myself. What are the most joyful things in my life? I think about my relationship with my wife. I mean, just one of the greatest joys in my life is being married to her. But I wouldn't stand up here and tell you that it's just easy and a bed of roses and always goes well. Even in the most joyful things in my life, there's an opportunity for misunderstanding, hurt, bitter words, pain. Those of you who are married know what I'm speaking about. Raising my kids, that I think is something that just brings joy into my life. But for those of us who are parents, we know that it just isn't easy all the time. I mean, I've got a 6-year-old, I've got a 4-year-old, I've got a newborn baby. There are times when the baby is screaming, when the 4-year-old is breaking something, and the 6-year-old isn't listening to us at all. And I'm thinking to myself, get me out of here, let me get out to the garage. And you know what people are coming up and saying to me? Watch out when they're teenagers. And it doesn't end there. I mean, in this room, we'll have those of us who have adult children where things aren't the way they're supposed to be. There are rifts in relationships. There are some adult children that we haven't spoken to in years. There's hurt, there's pain, there's misunderstanding. Even our greatest joys in this life are often filled with pain as a result of sin that's entered into our world. And as Moses reflects upon all this, he says, wow, God, relent, O Lord. How long will it be? Have compassion on us. And I think it's good, especially at a time like this where we're marking time, we have an opportunity to step back and just survey things, to step away from our illusion of self-importance and grandeur and realize that for most of us, our life is exactly as Moses describes, brief, quickly forgotten, almost meaningless, and full of toil and pain. But it wouldn't be good to leave it there, because there's a prayer that Moses prays at the end of this poem, which I think, if we've come to a place where we can understand what it is Moses is saying here, is an important prayer for us to look at. He begins in verse 14 by saying this: satisfy us in the morning with your unfailing love, that we may sing for joy and be glad all our days. Make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many years as we have seen trouble. May your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. May the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. And then he says this, establish the work of our hands for us. And then he repeats the line, yes, establish the work of our hands. I think the idea is something like this. Moses realizes that if God doesn't show up and enter into this brief life we have, if he doesn't do something magnificent or glorious, then we may have missed it all. He says in verse 16, may your deeds be shown to your servants, your splendor to their children. God, you've got to show up. You've got to intervene here. You've got to make this worthwhile. And he says, may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. And then he says this, establish the work of our hands. Then he repeats that line, yes, establish the work of our hands. The rest of this psalm is about how fleeting life can be, that you just, and it's gone. And at the end, he just pleads out to God, God, may something I do with my hands last for eternity. May some of my work, some of my toil, may you make that be established. Maybe I can do it this way. Once I was in college, I sat down in a college class. I had a professor. He was a short man, very quiet, and he entered into class not saying a word. He grabbed a piece of chalk. We had a long classroom with a long chalkboard. He grabbed a piece of chalk, and he started at the very end of one of the chalkboards, and he just started drawing a line. Didn't say anything to us, didn't turn to us, but just drew this line all the way across the chalkboard, and then made an arrow. Looked something like this. And when he had gotten all of our attention, he said, as an example, the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 3 talks about how God has set eternity in our heart. And there's this sense in which we all know that our life had a beginning at some point, but it's going to go on and go forever and be everlasting. There is an eternity set before us. And this is what he said. He said, the 70 or 80 years we get in this life, if you were to represent them in light of eternity, you would have to walk all the way back to the start of the class, chalkboard, and if you can go to the next slide, he said it would be a hash line just like that. On the one side is this very short amount of time, and that's what it looks like in light of all the eternity that God has set in our hearts before us. He said the conviction of the Bible is this, that what happens in that very short amount of time will in some way impact or make a difference in light of all of eternity. So that's worth thinking about. I agree. We get this brief, short light. And the Bible's conviction is that what happens here in this life in some way or another impacts what's going to happen for the rest of eternity. I think implied in this question or in this statement is this idea that in light of this brief time we get now, what is it that's really going to matter? And Moses has this prayer, and it's something like this: God, if you don't show up, if you don't show us something mighty, if you don't intervene, then we're going to miss it all. We need you, God, to be at work establishing the work of our hands. God, we look to you.